She said she was having dinner with her boss, and that must have sounded banal, routine, part of the duties of any dedicated professional. I had done it so many times myself. Corporate dinners, late meetings, the kind of thing you don't even question when you trust the person you've been by your side for years. I wished her luck, told her to enjoy herself, and even suggested a better restaurant than the one she'd chosen. But something inside me, a strange silence in her eyes, a slight averted glance when I mentioned the children before she left, something there kept hammering like an uncomfortable presence deep in my soul. I tried to ignore it, I swear. I went to bed early, but the pillow seemed to push me back to reality. At 9 p.m., I got up, put on my jacket, got in a car, and drove to the restaurant. At first, I felt ridiculous, a jealous, suspicious, almost childish husband. But when I parked the car in front of the bistro and saw her there, sitting at the table with him, the boss, the two of them laughing like teenagers on vacation, she wearing a dress I had never seen before, with a look of someone who was no longer afraid of being caught, something inside me began to crumble. She took his hand. He touched her face. She smiled. And then, in a gesture that would tear any man's soul apart, they kissed. Long. Without guilt. Without rushing. In that moment, it wasn't just my marriage that died. It was the image I had of the woman I had built a life with. The mother of my children. The person who knew my secrets, my fears, my dreams. It was like watching your own heart being ripped out of your chest by hands you loved. I left there in silence. I didn't make a scene. I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I drove home with such a strange calm that it frightened me. When I walked into the house, I saw my children's backpacks thrown on the couch, their toys on the living room floor, her still wet toothbrush in the bathroom. Everything there said, family. But nothing made sense anymore. The next morning, when she woke up, she smelled the fresh coffee and maybe thought everything was okay. She came downstairs smiling, said, "Good morning," and I simply responded with the firmness of a verdict, "This afternoon you will receive the divorce petition. And just to be clear, I will not let you walk away with anything. Not even custody of the children." Her silence was like an implosion. The cup fell from her hand, shattering on the floor, but nothing she said there would help. She tried to speak, stuttering out silly excuses like, "It was just a moment," or "You've changed too," and finally, the most pathetic phrase of all, "We can still fix this." No, we couldn't. And more than that, I didn't want to. What she didn't know, what she never would have guessed, was that I had recorded everything. I had evidence, witnesses, messages, digital traces. And yes, I had a plan. She wanted to play the lie, so I would give her the truth with all my sharp teeth. Throughout the proceedings, I tried to maintain my composure. While she begged me for a deal, while she said that all this would affect the children, that we could keep the house, the routine, the appearances. I just smiled. Her lawyer, a pretentious and arrogant guy, tried to intimidate me in the first meeting. "My client is willing to negotiate," he said. And I just stared at him and replied, "Your client has already negotiated enough. Now it's my turn." I didn't want half. I wanted justice. And justice sometimes demands surgical precision. The custody hearing was the final battleground. And it was there, in that crowded courtroom, with the judge watching her closely, that fate took its first full turn. The video presented by my defense didn't just show a kiss. It showed her drunk, laughing loudly, holding her boss's hand, putting her head on his shoulder, and, at the end, tripping over her own steps as they left the restaurant. And who recorded that? One of my childhood friends, who happened to be a regular customer at the restaurant. He saw it, recognized it, and recorded it. That wasn't just betrayal. It was a lack of control. It was irresponsibility. And in light of that, the judge didn't even hesitate. I won sole custody of my children. Her reaction was that of a woman who had lost everything and, only then, understood that the game was real. "You can't do this to me," she screamed in court. I'm their mother. But what is a mother, besides a title, when she puts aside everything that matters? She tried to get back together. She tried to use her children, she tried to make scenes, show up unannounced, call me in the middle of the night saying she still loved me. But love is not something that regenerates after the ruin. And more than anything, self-love, when it wakes up, does not go back to sleep. People always say that time heals everything. But sometimes, time is just the interval between betrayal and rebirth. And I was reborn. I moved house. I reorganized my life. I started smiling again for the right reasons. I rediscovered simple pleasures like cooking for the boys, telling them stories at bedtime, playing soccer on Saturdays. And in the midst of this new normal, I met someone. No rush. No expectations. A woman who had also been betrayed, who knew exactly where it hurt and therefore, where to heal. But the most unexpected thing was yet to come. That woman I saw falling apart in court, who I saw being abandoned by her lover days after the hearing, had not yet hit rock bottom. The real blow of fate would come when she thought she could still manipulate everything. When she believed she could use her children to get something from me. When she came up with the final plan, the one she believed was infallible. But what she didn't know was that I was already prepared. And that she no longer had control over anything. What happened next, what was revealed in that final meeting, changed everything. Including the way she would be remembered by those who mattered most, her own children. And that's when everything changes. Because what seemed to be the end, was just the beginning of justice. What did she do at dinner besides the kiss? What happened to her lover after that video? And why did she try to get back together even though she knew I didn't want her anymore? The truth behind her betrayal goes far beyond a dinner with her boss. It goes beyond sharing a bed. She hid something. And that something, cost much more than a marriage. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they show with intensity how infidelity can destroy lives, homes, and true loves. Each narrative is a warning, a deep reflection on choices and consequences. Get ready, because today's story will shock you. Good listening. Richard and Amanda were a couple who, to outsiders, seemed to live the harmony that so many people longed to achieve. Together for 12 years, they had built a stable and respected life, with 2 small children, a cozy home in a leafy neighborhood, and a routine that, even amid the rush of work and family responsibilities, still preserved intimate rituals of affection, such as the coffee prepared with care on the weekends, or the note left next to the toothbrush. Amanda worked as a marketing manager at a technology company and was known for her intelligence, elegance, and absolute control of situations. Richard, on the other hand, was a civil engineer and the owner of a local construction company that had grown over the last decade and provided him with a certain financial comfort, enough to keep his family safe, without exaggeration, but with dignity. He was calm, observant, the type who speaks less and feels more, while Amanda always stood out for her fluid communication, her social brilliance, and her way of keeping everyone around her attentive to her opinions. The relationship between the two had never been one of great explosions or drama. It was a story made of silent complicity, made of hands that found each other without needing to look, of glances that completed sentences at dinners with friends, of a trust that seemed to have deeper roots than any gale could uproot. When the children arrived, first Noah and 2 years later little Alice, the house was filled with new priorities, new fears, but also a deeper, more mature love. Amanda, even though she was involved in her career, made a point of participating in school events, medical appointments, and homework. And Richard, in turn, adapted his work schedules to take the children to school at least twice a week. They split like a tight-knit team. And even though their routines became more demanding every year, they still found time for themselves. Not every day. But often enough to stay connected. In Richard's eyes, Amanda was everything. And not out of blind idealization, but out of genuine admiration. She was intelligent, articulate, and always had a strategic vision for everything, from a campaign project to the best way to deal with a family conflict. He admired how she could maintain her composure even in pressure-packed situations, how she had quick answers on the tip of her tongue, and how her laughter, although rarer lately, could light up the room. Amanda also had a deep admiration for Richard. She knew he was a man of integrity, of firm words, with solid values that would not bend to convenience. She knew she could trust him for anything, from a financial crisis to the moments when everything seemed to be falling apart emotionally. He was the one who silently hugged her when she needed peace. He was the one who said, even without saying it, that he was there. Family weekends were, for Amanda, a small respite from the corporate chaos. She allowed herself to turn off her devices, put on an old t-shirt, walk barefoot around the house with her children and laugh at silly things. Richard loved these versions of Amanda that no one else saw. The woman with her hair tied up any which way, who forgot the pan on the stove because she was busy drawing with Alice, or who laughed out loud at the jokes Noah learned in school. These simple, everyday scenes were for him the purest form of love. And that was what kept them together. Or at least that's what he believed. In the last few months, however, some small changes had begun to emerge. Nothing drastic, nothing that sounded like an obvious alarm. Just details. Amanda was increasingly absorbed in her work. She started arriving late, saying that the company's demands had increased because of a new account they were managing. Meetings with the board of directors were getting longer, networking events were multiplying. Richard, for his part, tried not to be intrusive. He was never controlling. He always respected his wife's space and independence. He knew that Amanda was ambitious, passionate about what she did, and he would never think of limiting that. He understood. But something was starting to bother him. It wasn't the time. It was the distant look in her eyes. The lack of interest in talking about the day. The silences during dinner, which had previously been comfortable, began to weigh like invisible walls between them. One night, after putting the kids to bed, Richard sat next to her on the couch. Amanda had her laptop on her lap, her eyes fixed on a presentation. He tried to make conversation, talking about a new project he was starting in a condominium and how demanding the client was. Amanda responded with a, without looking up. Minutes later, she closed the computer and said she needed to go to bed early, that the next day would be exhausting. She went to the bedroom and didn't even notice that Richard had been sitting there, motionless, staring into space for long minutes. That absence, that hole of presence that she left, began to grow. But he still couldn't name what it was. The children began to notice, too. Alice, just 5 years old, asked one Sunday, "Daddy, why doesn't Mommy come to the park for ice cream anymore?" Richard made some excuse, saying she was tired. But the question kept echoing inside him. Little by little, he realized that Amanda was moving away not only from him, but from the world they had built together. It was as if she were going to a place where he and the children no longer fit. But still, he clung to hope. He sent loving messages, prepared surprise dinners, wrote notes, just like in the old days. And she thanked him. Always polite. Always distant. One night, while he was arranging a picture frame in the children's room, Richard found an envelope lying behind the dresser. It was an invitation to a corporate dinner at Amanda's company, dated 2 weeks earlier. An event she hadn't mentioned. He hesitated to think about it any further. He tried to rationalize. Maybe she'd been invited at the last minute. Maybe it was something small. He didn't want to be paranoid. But doubt, once planted, sprouts like a weed. It grows quickly. It eats away at certainties less. That same week, Amanda announced that she would have another dinner with her boss, something formal, with no set end time. Richard just nodded. He smiled. But inside, something was quietly breaking. The house that was once filled with children's laughter, the sound of pots on the stove and conversations on the porch began to have increasingly longer periods of silence. Amanda became more withdrawn each day, like a flower that withdraws at night and never opens again. Richard, even realizing it, avoided confrontation. Maybe out of fear of the answer. Maybe for love. Or perhaps because they didn't want to accept that, despite all their efforts, something was being lost. Time, children, routine, plans for the future, everything seemed to be moving forward, but without the same pulse as before. He still loved her. With all his strength. But something told him that this love was being challenged by something bigger than he could control. Amanda, on the other hand, seemed to live on a different frequency. Her schedule was more erratic. Her phone calls were shorter. Her hugs were quick, like an obligation. Her cell phone was always turned upside down. Her gaze was more distant. When questioned, she said it was stress, that she needed space, that she couldn't handle so many demands anymore. Richard believed her. He wanted to believe her. But the feeling that he was being pushed away from his own story was inevitable. He watched his children grow up, watched love drip down the sides of a glass that could no longer hold its contents. And Amanda. Amanda seemed to no longer see it. Nothing in her behavior was violent or cruel. But it was in that subtlety that the biggest blow lay. Because when someone you love simply stops looking at you the way they used to, the body may remain, but the soul is already gone. And that was what hurt Richard. The absence within the presence. The distance within the house. The silence after the, "I love you." He still didn't know what was happening. He didn't know that a dark truth was hidden behind those dinners. But something inside him was beginning to wake up. Slowly. Irremediably. And when it woke up completely, nothing would ever be the same again. The following weeks passed like loose leaves in the wind, without direction, without control. Richard immersed himself in his daily routine, trying to maintain what was left of balance at home. He took his children to school, reviewed the construction company's budgets, went back to prepare dinner, read stories to the children as if the words were shields that kept him from thinking about the void that was growing between him and Amanda. She, in turn, seemed to be diving into a parallel reality, increasingly immersed in a routine that she no longer shared with anyone. Her smiles became rare and brief, no longer spontaneous as before. Her eyes, when they met Richard's, seemed to scan the surface only out of obligation. And though the touch was still there, the kiss on the forehead as they left, the murmured goodnight in the dark, there was no soul in them anymore. Richard felt everything, but refused to confront it. Perhaps out of fear of confirming what the heart already intuited. The children began to ask for their mother more often. Alice missed playing on the living room carpet and watching cartoons on Sunday afternoons. Noah avoided the subject, but he was quieter, more reactive. Richard noticed the effects of Amanda's distance in the children's small gestures. They felt. The home, once so lively, was now a sequence of silent corridors, of meals eaten without conversation, of beds made with the coldness of a hotel. The house looked spotless, but the coldness was palpable. Richard tried to fill the gaps of absence with increased attention to his children, with constant presence. But nothing could replace a mother. And he knew that this absence came from something deeper, something that still had no name, but that manifested itself with the force of a storm gathering on the horizon. Amanda started changing her perfume. She stopped wearing the one Richard had given her for her last birthday and started wearing a stronger, unfamiliar fragrance. She swapped her formal attire for more daring dresses on nights when she said she had important meetings. She started wearing more makeup, even when she claimed that the night would only be with coworkers. One day, he left his cell phone on the kitchen table and, without realizing it, Richard saw the screen light up with a notification: "The table is reserved for 8 p.m. I can't wait to see you smile." It was a number saved with only initials. He didn't touch the device. Did not open messages. It did not invade privacy. But at that moment, his heart raced as if he had run a marathon. His hands were sweating, his mind racing to 1,000 different places, but still, he hesitated to conclude the obvious. That night, Amanda left saying she had a meeting with the project director and that she might be back late. Richard nodded with a calculated smile and held back the wave of an internal volcano that threatened to overflow. As soon as she left, he put the children to bed, drove out of the house quietly, and stopped on a corner near the most sophisticated restaurant in the area. He had a feeling. And it was there, across the street, that he saw her. Amanda got out of a taxi, checked the rearview mirror and carefully fixed her hair, then entered the restaurant with the ease of someone expecting something pleasant, something intimate. The red dress she was wearing was new. He had never seen it before. He waited a few more minutes. He took a deep breath. He crossed the street. And went inside. The restaurant's atmosphere was elegant and welcoming, with yellowish lights that gave the place a romantic aura. Richard spotted the table in the most private corner, near the window. Amanda was with a man. He was about 10 years older, with neatly trimmed gray hair, an impeccable suit, and a smile that was too comfortable for the situation. They were holding half-empty glasses of wine, laughing like old acquaintances, like lovers in perfect harmony. Amanda touched his face. He caressed her hand across the table. And then, as if the world had paused to allow the truth to reveal itself without noise, they kissed. Long unhurried. As if they were alone in the universe. Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He left the restaurant unseen, like a shadow that disappears into the darkness. He drove for hours aimlessly, without music, without words. The city passed by the car windows in a blur, while his chest tightened with an almost physical pain, a knot that would not be untied. The images repeated themselves in his head, the touch, the kiss, the smiles. It was all real. There was no denying it anymore. It was not paranoia. It was not exaggeration. It was betrayal. Pure and shameless. A cold betrayal, built on absence, on dissimulation, on the cowardice of those who avoid dialogue. When he got home, the children were sleeping peacefully. He stood in front of the door for long minutes before going in. He knew that that night would mark the end of an era. And there was no going back. Not for him. Not after that. The next day, Amanda acted normally. He prepared breakfast, asked about the children, said he would need to leave early. Richard just watched. She looked like an actress on stage, with memorized lines, automatic gestures. But he saw. You knew. And inside him, something had changed. A flame of indignation, of contained fury, was beginning to form. He wasn't the kind of man who shouted, who exposed. But he also wasn't the type to accept being made a fool of. That night, while she slept, he went to the office and began to put together his plan. He gathered extracts, organized documents, separated the messages he had discreetly photographed. He looked for a lawyer. They recommended a family law specialist with a reputation for being relentless. He was determined. She wouldn't allow Amanda to take anything that wasn't rightfully hers. And most importantly, he would not leave his children under the influence of a woman who chose ego over family. During the days that followed, Amanda didn't notice the change. Or maybe she did, but she underestimated it. Richard followed the same routine, the same smile, but now with a sparkle in his eyes that hid a silent conviction. He organized everything behind the scenes, with the precision of a surgeon. On the morning of the preliminary hearing, when she received the summons for the divorce petition, she was taken by surprise. The shock was visible. She tried to argue, to say that everything could be resolved calmly, that they were just going through a difficult phase. Richard, impassive, simply replied, "The time for the truth is past. Now it's time for the consequences." She turned pale. Her gaze searched for something in his. But found nothing. The children began to notice the tense atmosphere. Alice had a crying fit when she saw Amanda packing her bags to spend the weekend at her sister's house. Noah locked himself in his room for longer than usual. Richard tried to protect them, to shield them from the emotional storm that was forming. But I knew that soon everything would come to light. Because secrets, no matter how well hidden, have an expiration date. And hers was about to expire. On the last night before the custody hearing, Amanda called Richard asking to talk. She said she regretted it, that she was confused, that she still loved him. He listened, silently, staring into her eyes. She tried to touch him. He stepped back. He said that now everything was in the hands of justice. And she, perhaps for the first time, understood that she had lost control. The climax was approaching. And with it, a truth much greater than a simple extramarital affair. Because what Richard didn't know yet was that that dinner, that kiss, were just the surface of something much deeper, much darker. And that, when the veil fell completely, he would see that the betrayal was just the beginning of a story that would change everything he thought he knew about Amanda, about his own life, and about what had really brought them together for all those years. The courtroom was chilly, not because of the temperature of the air, but because of the heaviness that hung over the room. Amanda entered with hesitant steps, eyes downcast, trying to maintain a composure that had been slipping through her fingers for weeks. Richard was already there, sitting firmly, hands clasped on the table, as if preparing for some kind of silent war. The judge entered, the lawyers stood up, the custody hearing was beginning, but for Richard, this was more than a legal dispute, it was a chance to show the world, and his own conscience, who had truly been faithful to the family, and who had turned everything into ruin. Amanda tried, in the first few minutes, to maintain the narrative that the children needed their mother's constant presence, that her recent estrangement was the result of professional stress, but her face trembled with each argument, as if the facade were slowly giving way. Richard's lawyer asked to call a surprise witness. A middle-aged man in a dark suit with a face that was all too familiar to Amanda. He was the maitre d' at the restaurant where she met her lover. He confirmed the weekly meetings, the wines, the smiles, and the kisses. He even confirmed that on 2 occasions Amanda brought gifts and left hours after dinner straight for the hotel that was just a few blocks away. Amanda looked away. She avoided looking at her husband, as if each word were acid corroding her defenses. But nothing had prepared that environment for what was to come next. Richard's lawyer approached the judge and asked for permission to show a video. Silence filled the room. Amanda hugged her arms against her body, as if she already knew what was coming, but still had no idea how much she would be exposed. The video began to play on the screen. It was a cell phone video, filmed discreetly. It showed Amanda and the man she was having an affair with, her boss, on a balcony, laughing loudly, both visibly drunk. But that wasn't all. What was being seen there was more than just an extramarital encounter. It was neglect. It was mockery. The man talked loudly about how Amanda had helped with some internal decisions at the company, mentioned embezzling campaign funds, and mentioned using cards from her and Richard's joint account to pay for dinners and gifts. He laughed and said that, at least someone is making her husband work for the romance. Amanda, instead of reacting with embarrassment, laughed. She laughed and toasted. The recording continued with them entering the hotel room, kissing hurriedly. The judge stopped the video before the content became even more intimate. Amanda was in shock. She tried to say something, but her throat felt dry, her mouth half open without sound. Richard remained silent. He didn't need to say anything. The images had done it for him. The judge called a 15-minute recess. Amanda left the room like a ghost and went to the hallway where, for the first time in weeks, she faced Richard alone. He looked at her firmly, without hatred, but with the lucidity of someone who had finally seen everything. She tried to speak, her voice trembling. She said that she had never intended to destroy the family, that things had gotten out of control. Richard responded calmly, but with each syllable like a blade. He said that the betrayal had not been just physical, nor emotional. It was a betrayal against their life project, against their children, against everything they had built. And he added, looking into her eyes with deep regret, that the worst part was not the betrayal itself, but the silent contempt with which she treated him while everything was happening. Amanda, for the first time, cried. Not tears of false regret, but tears of panic. Because she understood that he was, in fact, determined to move on without her. But then, when the judge returned and the hearing seemed to be coming to an end, Richard's lawyer requested that a parallel complaint, recently filed, be included. Something that would change everything. Amanda looked at her own lawyer in surprise, who also didn't know what it was about. The judge authorized it. The new evidence was an audio recording. A file sent anonymously to Richard's lawyer the night before. The voice was male. It was the lover's. In the recording, he confessed that Amanda had used confidential company data to manipulate dismissal and promotion decisions within the department. She had, according to him, directly influenced the downfall of a colleague who could hinder the growth of their relationship. But the most shocking part came next. The recording clearly stated that Amanda had tried to convince her lover to hold Richard responsible for an alleged leak of strategic information, in order to remove him from the construction company's contract with the city government. She wanted to remove him from the professional scene. She wanted to destabilize him. And the justification she gave, according to her lover, was that, if he falls, I get everything. The courtroom froze. Even the judge took a few seconds to process what she had heard. Amanda went pale as a sheet. She mumbled that it was a lie, that she would never say something like that, but the recording was clear, detailed, full of dates and specific mentions. Richard just closed his eyes for a moment. The marital betrayal was enough to hurt him, but the professional scam, the attempt to sabotage his livelihood, the planned betrayal, this went beyond that. It was a betrayal of the soul. The judge requested the temporary suspension of Amanda's parental rights until the case was fully investigated. The words fell like a hammer blow on her shoulders. The woman who had come to court hoping for a reconciliation was now leaving it carrying the accusation of sabotage and possible fraud. On the way out, Amanda tried to get closer to Richard. She asked to talk in private. They walked together to the parking lot. Night was already falling, the cold wind cut through the words in the air. She said she had made a mistake, that her lover had manipulated her, that everything had gotten out of control, that she had never meant for it to go this far. Richard looked at her intently and asked in a firm, almost whispered voice, "When did you start hating me to the point of wanting to destroy me?" Amanda's eyes widened, surprised by the question. She said she had never hated him. He replied, "Then it's worse, because you did all this while loving me. And that's even more unforgivable." She fell to her knees in tears on the asphalt. People passed by, but no one approached her. Richard walked away, got in his car, and drove away. From that day on, life went on like an open scar. Amanda's public image began to crumble. Her lover disappeared, was fired, and was involved in an internal investigation. She lost her job, was exposed in internal company groups, and colleagues distanced themselves. Even though they didn't understand everything, her children refused to sleep outside their father's house. Noah stopped answering her calls. Alice cried every time she saw her mother. Richard, for his part, remained firm, rebuilding his daily life with his children, who were now even more present. But there was a pain he still carried. A mixture of mourning and liberation. And it was this pain that would guide him to the last act of this story. Because there was still something that Amanda didn't know. And that something would forever change the way she would be remembered by those who mattered most. And for Richard, it would be the last piece of the puzzle. The time that followed the trial seemed to not obey natural laws. For Amanda, the days dragged on like an invisible sentence, where everything that was solid collapsed in silence. There was no longer an office, no longer a boss, no longer a house full of life. All that remained was the insistent sound of her cell phone without notifications, the walls of a hastily rented apartment, and the constant memory of the moment when everything slipped through her own fingers. Richard had completely disappeared from her radar, and her children, once so close, now seemed to be orbiting a world that she was no longer allowed to enter. Every attempt to contact her was a collision against the concrete of rejection. Alice didn't respond to the videos she sent. Noah, colder, more mature, didn't even accept her calls. And this son's silence was more devastating than any cry of hurt. Amanda spent hours staring at the drawings stuck on the fridge, the ones left over from the old house, with a glass of wine that she repeated every night, as if it could wash away the guilt, erase the voices that hammered in her head. On the other hand, Richard maintained a surgical composure. He didn't speak to Amanda, he didn't mention her name at home, and he tried his best to avoid letting himself be carried away by confusing feelings. There was no more room for regret. It was just him and his children. And, little by little, he discovered a version of himself that he might never have accessed, more patient, more present, more whole. He built a new routine. Mornings with improvised pancakes, nights with movies and blankets on the couch, weekends with walks in the park or short trips to places that held family memories. And even in the memories, even in the absences, he refused to allow the pain to take control. What was driving him now was another force. Something that grew as Amanda fell apart, the conviction that everything needed to have a dignified ending, even if that meant looking into the eyes of the past one last time. It was on any given afternoon, when Alice came home from school with a drawing in her hands, that everything began to change. She handed the colored sheet to her father and, with that innocent smile that only children have, said, "Today the teacher asked us to draw the strongest person in the world." Richard looked at the drawing and saw himself, holding hands with his two children, with a blue cape on his back and a huge smile. It tore him apart inside. But what really stopped him came right after, when Alice added, "Mommy was also in my drawing, but the teacher asked us to choose just one person." He just nodded, hugged his daughter, and held her for a long time. That night, when he went to bed, he stared at the ceiling for long hours. Something inside him whispered that there were still scores to be settled. And despite everything, Amanda was still the mother of his children. And there was something unfinished between them. 2 days later, he showed up at her apartment door, unannounced. Amanda opened the door with tired eyes and a barely contained fright. She tried to hide her dishevelment, the internal mess that was reflected in the dimly lit room. He came in without asking permission. He sat on the sofa, observed the place for a few seconds and then looked at her with disconcerting calm. She sat facing him, her hands trembling in her lap. The silence was dense, but not hostile. Amanda was the first to speak, her voice low, almost swallowed by her own throat. She said that she had never felt so alone, that now she understood what she had lost, that her lover disappeared as soon as the scandal broke, that people at work had turned their faces away, and that she had no one else. Richard remained silent, until he said, with a coldness that cut through, "You did all this with the illusion that you would get out of it in one piece." Amanda tried to justify it, to say that the relationship started as an escape, that she felt invisible at home, that the other man made her feel wanted, heard, but deep down she knew that no words there would have the power to reverse what had been destroyed. It was then that Richard changed his tone. He said he wasn't there out of anger or regret. He was there because, despite everything, his children needed to know who their mother was, and he needed to understand how such an intelligent, focused woman had allowed all of this to happen. Amanda took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears, and then, for the first time, she said something she had never said before. She said that the boss, the man she had gotten involved with, had made promises that went beyond the obvious. That he used confidential company information, that he manipulated people behind the scenes, that he threatened to harm her career if she broke off the relationship. She said that at first she believed she was in control, but that little by little she realized she was trapped in a web of manipulation, where giving in became the only way to keep up appearances. But what really shocked Richard was what she said next. Amanda confessed that, in the weeks leading up to the divorce, she had received a direct proposal from her lover. He wanted her to fight in court for custody of the children, promising to use his contacts in the legal system to turn the tables in his favor. In exchange, she would be promised a comfortable life, a prominent position in the new company where he would be promoted, and a financial stability that she would never have on her own. And for a moment, a miserable moment, she considered it. She even consulted a second lawyer in secret. But then, one random late afternoon, she saw Noah sleeping on the couch with a book in his arms, and she understood that she couldn't do that. She couldn't use the children as bargaining chips. She cancelled the appointment. And decided to confess everything. But it was too late. The audio had already been delivered, and the court had already ruled. The price of her hesitation was complete ruin. Richard listened to everything with his eyes fixed on her. There was no shouting. There was no scandal. Just a silence that spoke too loudly. When she finished, he simply said, "You almost used our children as an instrument of power. That is what hurts me the most." Amanda cried in a restrained way, as if her tears no longer had any strength. And then, in a break that not even she expected, she asked if he still hated her. Richard answered no. He said that the opposite of love is not hate. It is indifference. And that, as hard as it was, he was now indifferent to what she decided to do with her life. The only thing that still mattered was the well-being of Noah and Alice. And that, if she wanted to rebuild anything, even if it was just her children's trust, she would have to start from scratch. No shortcuts. No manipulation. Before leaving, Richard looked around and said something Amanda would never forget: "You didn't lose me. You lost yourself. And that path is the hardest of all." He closed the door and walked down the stairs without looking back. Amanda sat there, motionless, staring into the emptiness of the room, as if she had finally understood that everything, absolutely everything, had been a consequence of her own choices. That night, she didn't drink wine. He didn't cry. Just wrote. He began a letter to his children. Not intended to be read immediately. But with the desperate desire to one day be able to show that, despite her mistakes, there was still a piece of mother inside her. And that, maybe, just maybe, with time and the right courage, that piece could find its place again. The rain started to fall outside. And for the first time in months, Amanda listened to the sound of water hitting the window with a clear conscience. Because from the bottom of the well, you only go up. But every step back requires more than forgiveness. Demands redemption. And this one, she knew, would not be easy to conquer. Time, after a collapse, acquires a strange consistency. It doesn't move slowly or quickly, it just creeps silently, rearranging the wreckage, pushing people toward new versions of themselves, some better, some more cautious. Amanda woke up early every day now, not out of obligation, but out of restlessness. He would wake up with his face swollen from constant insomnia, go to the window and look at the movement on the street as if he were watching life go by from outside. The routine was made up of short steps, small choices. She had gone back to cooking for herself, making her bed with an almost symbolic care, as if she wanted to convince the universe that she still had control over something. He avoided social media, ignored phone calls from his old team, and uninstalled the apps that used to fill his breaks with useless distractions. He had realized, too late, that the loudest noise came from within. And that silence, however cruel, was the only way to face the truth without filters. In the old house, Richard lived another reality. The days were now marked by emotional stability, by a routine that was re-establishing itself with balance. He had hired a child psychologist to monitor Noah and Alice, worried about the aftermath of what they had experienced. He actively participated in the sessions, showing himself willing to listen, to understand the signals that his children transmitted with their looks and attitudes. He avoided mentioning Amanda as much as possible, not out of spite, but because he understood that his children needed a reinterpreted maternal figure and not a narrative filled with resentment. The school noticed an improvement in the children's behavior, the teachers began to praise their emotional development, and Richard, little by little, allowed himself to breathe more easily. At night, after putting the children to bed, he would sit on the porch with a cup of tea in his hands and stay there in silence, just watching the sky, as if he were searching the stars for some answer he had not yet found. And, within this new rhythm, something unexpected happened. During a lecture on professional ethics organized by the Association of Engineers to which he belonged, Richard met Laura. She was a lawyer and a speaker at the event, and her talk about integrity in public contracts drew attention due to the clarity and firmness with which she exposed the moral dilemmas of the legal world. There was no immediate enchantment, nor was there a sudden attraction. It was something quieter, more real. They spoke briefly at the end of the presentation, exchanged contact details, and days later they met again by chance in a bookstore. Laura was a widow, mother of a 7-year-old boy, and she carried in her eyes the same tiredness that Richard tried to hide. They began to talk frequently, exchanging stories and confidences, not as someone seeking comfort, but as someone recognizing in the other a similar pain, an experience of loss that turns into maturity. Amanda, in turn, had begun to write compulsively. She filled notebooks with fragmented thoughts, childhood memories, and stories she had invented to try to understand herself. She was in therapy, recommended by her own lawyer, but also out of a sincere desire not to repeat the same mistakes. She knew that the trial was not yet completely over, that some legal decisions were still pending, and that her image in the eyes of her children was still fragile. She tried to regain small spaces. She sent illustrated letters to Alice, discreet gifts to Noah, not as a form of bargaining, but as bridges under construction. One afternoon, she received a reply from Alice, a drawing with the phrase, "I miss you, but I'm still mad." That broke her down more than any sentence. She felt the weight of each word, the effort of a daughter to be honest without hurting. And, more than ever, she understood that she would need to win back that love with actions, not with promises. It was in this context that Richard made an important decision. He arranged to meet Amanda at a discreet café, away from the eyes of other people. When she arrived, her expression was still dejected, but there was something different in her posture. She was more restrained, less defensive. They sat across from each other. The silence between them this time was not a cold war, but a mutual recognition of everything they had been through. Richard was not there to get back together, and she knew it. He was there to propose a pact. He said he wanted Amanda to be more involved in their children's lives, but that this would depend exclusively on her conduct, her responsible presence, and the rebuilding of the bond based on trust and truth. Amanda agreed, saying she didn't want privileges, just real opportunities. And then Richard revealed something Amanda hadn't expected. He talked about Laura. He said he had met someone, that he was taking small steps, slowly, but sincerely. Amanda took a deep breath. The pain in her stomach was immediate, but surprisingly she didn't freak out, didn't make a scene. She just asked if her children knew. Richard said yes, he had been transparent, that Laura would never be a substitute for her mother, and that was clear to everyone. Amanda nodded. And for the first time in months, she wished her ex-husband well. Not out of politeness, but because she knew that, despite everything, he deserved it. In the days that followed, Amanda visited a children's art school and volunteered. She began teaching creative expression classes to young children, using her mornings to prepare workshops and her afternoons to write children's stories inspired by Alice and Noah. His therapist praised his progress. He said that, for the first time, he saw in it an authentic movement towards reconstruction, not an attempt to compensate or erase the past, but to relearn how to exist. The nights were still lonely, but they were no longer constant nightmares. And on one of those nights, Amanda received an unexpected connection. It was Laura. The voice was gentle, firm. He said he would like to meet the mother of the children who were now also part of his life. Amanda froze for a few seconds, then replied that yes, she thought it was fair. They arranged to meet for coffee, and the meeting went much more smoothly than anyone expected. Laura was sensible and respectful. She said she admired the way Amanda was trying to rebuild her own story and that she wasn't there to compete for a place. Amanda, in turn, recognized the woman's courage in approaching her and thanked her. They talked for over an hour. When they said goodbye, there was no friendship, but there was a respect that could grow. Amanda knew that her relationship with her children would still take time to recover. That Noah might never see her in the same way again. But even so, for the first time, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. And that, however modest it may be, was a start. Meanwhile, Richard was preparing a trip with the children to a house in the countryside, inherited from his parents, where they had not been for years. I wanted to disconnect a little, breathe different air, give the children new experiences and, above all, create good memories, free from recent shadows. The idea was simple: bonfire at night, cheese bread for breakfast, bathing in the river. But it was in these simplicities that he began to rediscover the real value of life. Before traveling, he called Amanda and said that his children would send news. She thanked him, wished him a good trip, and held the phone in her hands for a few minutes, as if she were holding a piece of her rescued dignity there. What came next was still uncertain. There were no guarantees, no promises of ready-made happy endings. But the moral dilemma was now different. For Amanda, it was no longer enough to regain her children's love or Richard's trust. It was about recovering without depending on anyone else. For Richard, the challenge was allowing his children to reconnect with their mother without reopening wounds. And for children, perhaps the greatest of all, learning to love two versions of the same person, understanding that parents also fail, also get lost, and that sometimes strength lies in forgiving without forgetting. And that family, in the end, is not made of perfection, but of choices that persist, even after the fall. The trip to the interior proved to be more than just an escape from routine. For Richard, Noah and Alice, it was an emotional journey. The grandparents' house, old and rustic, exuded memories in every crack in the wood and in every aged photograph on the living room furniture. The scent of firewood and dried lavender permeated the air like a reminder of purer times, before the breakups, before the pains that now shaped their lives. There, far from everything and everyone, Richard found space to breathe easily, to observe his children without the interference of screens, commitments, and constant interruptions. Alice ran barefoot through the yard again, her dress whirling in the wind, her laughter echoing through the forest like a call to an intact childhood. Noah, more introspective, spent hours fishing with his father, and even in silence, the bond between them grew stronger in time with the calm waters of the lake. Richard felt that, little by little, he was rebuilding not only his sense of home, but also his children's trust in a world where love doesn't have to hurt to be real. On a particularly cold night, the three of them sat in front of the fireplace, covered in blankets, with mugs of hot chocolate in their hands. Alice was dozing on her brother's lap, and it was in that moment of peace that Noah looked at his father and asked, in a low, serious voice, "Will Mommy ever be okay?" Richard took a while to respond. "Not because I don't know, but because I understand the weight of that question." He said that everyone makes mistakes, and that sometimes, in order for someone to be whole again, they must first recognize each piece that was broken. Noah nodded thoughtfully and fell silent. Deep down, Richard knew that his children held much more in themselves than they expressed. He knew that his mother's absence was not just physical, it was also an emotional void that needed to be understood and, as far as possible, welcomed. The next morning, Alice asked if she could write a letter to Amanda. Richard handed her a notebook and said she could write whatever she wanted. When they were finished, they folded the sheet together, put it in a plain envelope, and saved it to take back. There was no promise of immediate shipping. It was just the first spontaneous gesture of reconnection. Meanwhile, Amanda kept herself busy. Now involved in a storytelling project at a community library, she was beginning to feel useful again. She discovered in the eyes of strangers a kind of forgiveness that she had not yet received from her own children. One rainy afternoon, she received a visit from Laura. It was unexpected, but not uncomfortable. Laura brought a gift from Alice, a keychain made of beads with the letter A, accompanied by a note with a simple, "Thank you for letting me draw again." Amanda held the gift with both hands as if holding onto a piece of solid ground after a long time of sinking. Laura did not stay long. She said she was only fulfilling a request from the girl. But before leaving, she looked Amanda in the eyes and calmly told her that she was on the right path, and that although there is no trust without scars, time can, indeed, be a good ally for those who are willing to start over. Amanda thanked her. When Laura left, she burst into tears. But they were not tears of despair. They were tears of relief. For the first time, I felt that I was, albeit slowly, returning to exist in the world I had lost. In the following days, Amanda decided to renovate the small apartment. She painted the walls light blue, changed the curtains, donated old objects that held painful memories, and bought new frames for photos that were yet to come. It was symbolic, but necessary. I felt that, in order to welcome my children back one day, the space needed to embrace a new story. At the end of the week, he went to the school where Alice studied and spoke to the pedagogical coordinator, asking if he could participate in a volunteer project for the art education classes. The coordinator, surprised by the initiative, said she would talk to management. Amanda didn't create expectations. I just wanted to show that I was there. That he could be present in a different way, without forcing, without invading, just offering what he had learned from his own mistakes. Richard, upon returning from his trip, found the house more alive. The children seemed lighter, less withdrawn. So did he. He decided to accept an invitation to have dinner with Laura and her son, Gabriel, at a simple but welcoming restaurant. During dinner, Gabriel and Alice exchanged drawings and stories. Noah began to talk more with Laura, and by the end of the evening, there was something there that seemed like the harbinger of a new family constellation. Not a replacement, not a new mother. Just a woman who understood the place she occupied and sought nothing more than mutual respect among everyone. When they returned home, Richard received a short message from Amanda thanking him for allowing Alice to send the gift. He responded with a simple, "She wanted it." It wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. It was real. And in that real, there was room for what was necessary. The dilemma that now hung over everyone was how to move on with dignity in the face of such a shattered past. Amanda needed to prove, day after day, that she was not there out of convenience, but out of true regret. And more than that, she needed to show that she had understood the scope of her choices. Some afternoons, when she returned from the library, she would stop in front of Alice's old dance school and watch the children leave, laughing, carrying their colorful backpacks. It wasn't melancholy, it was longing combined with responsibility. She knew that she could only be part of that universe again if she had patience, if she didn't demand emotional shortcuts from her children. She wrote letters and kept them in a box. She sent some, others not. She believed that maybe, one day, Alice and Noah would want to read them. And if they didn't, that was okay. That was so that she would never forget why she was trying. One sunny Saturday, Amanda went to the local market. She bought flowers and fruit, and while she was waiting for her change at the strawberry stand, she heard someone calling her name. She turned around slowly and found Richard. He was holding Alice's hand, who was running to a stand selling recycled toys. Their encounter was brief. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. Amanda simply said, "Good morning," and asked how they were. Richard replied that he was fine, in a neutral tone, and then went on to say that Alice had said she would like to invite her to watch the school's next performance, but that she wasn't sure if she should. Amanda simply said that if her daughter wanted to, she would be there. And that if she didn't want to, she would understand. Richard didn't say anything else. He just nodded and went after his daughter. Amanda stood there, her heart racing, the bag of strawberries almost slipping out of her hands. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her a new lease of hope. Late that afternoon, Richard had a long conversation with Noah. They discussed school, soccer, and friends, and in the middle of the conversation, Richard asked if he would have any problem seeing his mother in the audience at his sister's performance. Noah thought for a moment, then said no, as long as she just watched and didn't try to get closer. He said he wasn't ready. Richard respected that. And when he told Amanda this, via text message, she responded with gratitude and without insistence. She knew it was a privilege to be able to at least be a spectator of the world she had lost. And she would do so with the utmost respect. On the day of the presentation, Amanda arrived early, sat discreetly in the last row, and waited. When the children went up on stage, Alice saw her. He didn't smile, but his eyes sparkled. Amanda placed her hand over her heart and remained still. He cried silently throughout the entire performance. He cried for everything he didn't experience. For everything I still wanted to live. For everything that was still possible, even if in small doses. And there, in that audience full of fathers, mothers, grandparents and teachers, Amanda discovered that perhaps true love was not about always being present, but about being there in the most sincere way when you are allowed to. And she was whole. Silent. But present. And that, for someone who had already lost everything, was a more valuable beginning than any victory. The auditorium was nearly empty when Amanda walked down the stairs and out the side door. Alice's presentation had ended a few minutes ago, but she preferred to avoid the crowd of happy families at the exit. He walked slowly to the car, feeling each step as if he were learning to walk again, with a heavier body but a less disorganized soul. He knew that discreet presence had been a silent test, a chance to show that he would respect the imposed limits. And knowing that she could be there without causing discomfort was more than she expected. That night, when he got home, he opened the box where he kept the letters he never sent, and began to read them one by one. Some seemed naive, others no longer made sense, but there was one, written the week before, that seemed to have been waiting for this exact moment. He took the envelope and wrote Alice's name in neat letters. He posted it the next morning, no extra tickets, no orders. Just words. Meanwhile, Richard's life continued to change. His relationship with Laura matured with a tranquility that was almost strange for someone who had experienced a marriage marked by such emotional intensity. There were no demands, just presence and listening. He admired her for her practical way of dealing with life and for the way she respected his and his children's space. Laura knew that Richard's story was not one that could be erased, but one that needed to be understood with sensitivity. And this, more than anything else, created a bond between them based on maturity. Gabriel and Alice became inseparable friends. Noah, although still reserved, began to open up more, especially in the conversations that Richard patiently encouraged, without forcing anything. The new family structure did not replace the old one, but began to take on its own contours. It was as if they had stopped trying to glue the pieces together and had finally begun to sculpt something new with the pieces. One cloudy afternoon, Amanda received an unexpected email from an independent publisher who had read one of her short stories published on a children's literature blog. The publisher wanted to turn the story into a picture book. Amanda read the message 3 times before believing it. She spent weeks working on the illustrations and the final text, and when the book was released, she discreetly invited Laura and her children to the event. She knew they might not come, but she had to make the gesture. On the day of the launch, the hall was full of curious children and parents. Amanda walked up to the stage with hidden nervousness, but the moment she began to read, her voice steadied. At the end, when she was signing the copies, she saw Alice in line, holding the book with both hands. When it was her turn, Alice simply said, "This is my favorite autograph." Amanda held back tears. She signed her name and drew a small flower next to it. Alice returned to Laura's side, who was waiting with a subtle smile, and Amanda, in that moment, knew that she was, somehow, returning to the world of her children, step by step, gesture by gesture, with truth. Over time, Noah began to attend sessions with the psychologist more openly. In one of them, he said he felt angry at his mother, but that he also missed how she made him laugh when they cooked together. The professional encouraged him to write a letter. Noah wrote. Amanda responded with touching sincerity. They didn't see each other in person for weeks after that, but they continued to correspond. It was as if they needed to first meet on paper before sharing the same space again. The reunion took place months later, in a small coffee shop, where Noah arrived with Richard. Amanda was already there, waiting with sweaty hands. There was no hug, no impactful words. Noah just sat down, ordered a hot chocolate, and said, "We can talk." That's all. For her, that was everything. And so began the reconstruction of the most difficult bond. The bond of a son who had seen his mother collapse and was now trying, with his own small hands, to help her stand up. Time continued to march on with its relentless cycles. Amanda published 2 more children's books and began to be invited to give lectures at public schools about literature and personal reinvention processes. She never mentioned her story in detail. She would just say that everyone, at some point in their lives, is forced to choose between remaining stuck in error or moving towards the truth, even if it requires everything. Richard and Laura got married in a discreet ceremony in the countryside. Alice was the maid of honor, Gabriel carried the rings, and Noah gave a short speech at the end saying that life is full of new beginnings, and that sometimes, the second chance is not with someone else, but with a new way of seeing the same life. Amanda was not invited, and she understood perfectly. The ceremony was theirs. She no longer needed to be there for every moment. She was in her children's hearts, and that, now, was enough. Years later, Alice organized an exhibition of the drawings she had made throughout her childhood. She called the project, "The House in Pieces." One of the paintings depicted a female figure with deep cracks, but with flowers growing inside. Amanda looked at the drawing with teary eyes and said to herself that she never thought she would see flowers growing from her own mistake. Beside her, Noah, now a teenager, commented that it was his favorite painting. Amanda held his hand and said nothing. She had learned that silence is also a type of love. In the end, everyone went with their own version of healing. Richard found peace in accepting that some pain never goes away, it just changes. Amanda found purpose in understanding that forgiveness is not a gift, but a daily task. Noah found his confidence again when he realized that even childhood heroes can fail and still deserve a fresh look. Alice grew up between 2 strong women, one who raised her with stability, and another who taught her that mistakes are not eternal sentences, as long as there is courage to face them. And if you've made it this far, tell us in the comments, what did you think of this story? What would you do if you were in Richard's shoes? Do you think Amanda deserved a second chance, or are some scars too deep to be overcome? Your opinion is very important. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. Here we show, with intensity and realism, how betrayal can devastate everything that takes years to build. And let us make it clear once again, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. The stories you hear here are meant to make you reflect, to make an impact, and most importantly, to remind you that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt, but it will never be the same. Until next time.